The security guard of a luxurious restaurant was moved and allowed a street boy to play the violin in exchange for food, but when the restaurant owner arrived, night had already fallen over the city, covering it with a cloak of darkness, punctuated by the lights of shop windows and luxurious signs. The streets were wet from a light drizzle, and the biting cold swept the sidewalks, where hurried footsteps echoed aimlessly. Thomas walked slowly, his small body hunched against the wind. His only companion was the violin he carried carefully, a worn-out object but full of memories. It was the last link to his mother, whom he had lost very early. Now, every sound he drew from the instrument was an echo of her presence. He looked at the city around him with a mixture of fascination and resignation. The elegant clothing stores, the glittering restaurant facades, the expensive cars speeding by. Everything there was inaccessible to him, as if separated by an invisible glass. However, Thomas did not look with envy. He looked with a timid hope, a hope that could barely sustain his hunger but still burned, fragile, inside his heart. His stomach hurt, but the music, when played, brought a momentary peace. As he walked, the distant sound of laughter and conversations mixed with the rustling of dry leaves carried by the wind. The city seemed alive but not for him. No one noticed the small boy wandering the streets. No one saw the torn clothes, the disheveled hair, or the tired gaze. To the passers-by, he was just a shadow, an insignificant detail amidst the city's glow. Thomas, however, was used to being invisible. He stopped for a moment in front of a large window. The store displayed luxurious dresses, in vibrant colors, as if each piece told a story of glamour and success. He looked at the reflection of his own image in the glass. A painful contrast to everything he saw. The pale skin, sunken eyes, and hands holding the violin with almost frozen fingers. And yet, as fragile as he seemed, there was still something indomitable about him, something that resisted the cold, hunger, and indifference. The wind blew stronger, and Thomas huddled his shoulders, clutching the violin to his chest as if it were a talisman. Around him, the streets began to empty. People ran towards the warmth of their homes, leaving behind the deserted sidewalks and the lights of the establishments. He looked up at the sky, where thick clouds covered any sign of stars. That night, the city seemed even more distant, more indifferent than ever. But Thomas kept walking. With every step, the muffled sound of his feet against the wet ground felt more lonely, echoing through the deserted corners. His thoughts mixed with memories of his mother, the warmth of her voice, the nights when he played for her and she watched him, smiling with eyes full of pride. Now all that remained was that violin and the feeling that, somewhere, someone might hear what he had to say through his notes. He approached a large avenue, where an imposing restaurant gleamed on the corner. The elegantly dressed customers dined under the soft light of chandeliers. Thomas stopped for a moment, watching the people eating, laughing, and talking as if the world outside did not exist. He felt his stomach growl again, but more than the hunger, he felt something stronger, the desire to be heard. That, for a brief moment, his music could cross that glass and touch someone. Looking at the violin in his hands, Thomas took a deep breath. The city might be cold and distant, but inside him there was still warmth, there was still sound. Maybe, that night, someone would listen. And with that thought, he stepped a little closer to the restaurant entrance. Thomas approached the luxury restaurant with his eyes fixed on the grand glass doors. Inside, he could see the well-dressed customers, raising their wine glasses for toasts, their laughter echoing in the decor adorned with gleaming chandeliers. He felt a chill down his spine, but this time, it wasn't the biting wind that bothered him. It was the feeling of being small, insignificant amidst so much brightness and opulence. It was as if he was on the wrong side of an invisible barrier that separated him from that world. For a moment he hesitated. The hunger in his stomach was a constant pain, but the fear of rejection was almost as great. He had been chased away from other places before, treated as if his presence were an affront, an unwanted stain on the perfect scenery of those who lived in abundance. The disdainful looks from waiters, the murmurs of people as they passed by him, all these memories made him pause for a moment. He looked at the violin in his hands, the worn wood, the weakened strings, but also the only thing that still connected him to something good. He knew he couldn't keep wandering the city that night. His body was weak, the hunger made him dizzy, and the wind showed no signs of mercy. Somehow he needed to be heard. Even if only for a brief moment, he needed someone to see beyond the tattered clothes, beyond the boy who seemed lost and hungry. The violin, with all its signs of wear, was his only chance to communicate, to touch a heart willing to listen. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts telling him to give up. He knew he might be thrown out before he could even play the first note, but there was something inside him that pushed him to try, something stronger than fear. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother, who always told him that if he played with his heart, music could open doors he never knew existed. With each step he took toward the restaurant entrance, his heart raced. The customers inside continued immersed in their own lives, not noticing the small, fragile figure approaching from the other side of the glass. Thomas wondered if any of them had ever gone hungry, if any of them would understand what he was about to do. The violin was the only thing separating him from losing himself completely in that cold night. He stopped in front of the large glass doors, his trembling hands clutching the violin more tightly. The interior of the restaurant seemed even more unreachable up close. He could hear the muffled sound of conversations, the clinking of cutlery on porcelain plates, and the soft murmur of restrained laughter amidst the shimmering candles. It was a world so far removed from his that it almost seemed like an impossible dream. For a moment he thought about turning back, leaving behind this absurd idea and searching for a simpler, less intimidating place. But his body could no longer bear to delay the inevitable. He needed food, warmth, some gesture of humanity. Determined, he adjusted the violin on his shoulder and gently drew the bow across the strings. The initial sound was timid but loaded with an emotion that, without his knowing, began to penetrate the walls of that luxurious restaurant. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing the music to flow. Each note was a silent plea, a cry for something he couldn't put into words. In the cold night, surrounded by indifference and luxury, he decided to let himself be guided by the only thing that still made sense: his music. Ethan, the restaurant security guard, watched the street with the attentive gaze of someone used to keeping watch. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a firm expression, but behind that imposing appearance, there was a hidden gentleness. He didn't see himself as just another guard of shiny glass doors. He saw the people passing by. And that night, something caught his attention in a different way. Amidst the avenue's lights, he spotted a small, frail boy approaching the restaurant. Ethan frowned, intrigued. The boy was carrying a violin which looked almost as old as he was. The worn clothes and torn shoes were clear signs that life on the streets had been unforgiving to him. Ethan saw the boy stop in front of the restaurant, hesitate, and then stare at the imposing doors. Thomas's look was one of uncertainty and fear, as if he knew that inside that place, his presence was not desired. But there was also something deeper in his eyes, something Ethan immediately recognized: the desperate hope of someone who had already faced rejection but still believed in a small chance. For a moment, Ethan was transported back to his own childhood. He too had come from a humble home, struggling to survive in a city that didn't care. He remembered when his family had gone hungry, the times when he, like that boy, had stood outside restaurants, wishing someone would notice him, that someone would see him as more than a poor, dirty child. The image of the boy brought back memories that Ethan had buried but had never truly left him. It was at that moment that he decided he couldn't simply ignore him. The restaurant owner, the stern Mr. Collins, tolerated no violation of the strict rules that kept the place impeccable. Ethan knew that allowing the boy to stay there, let alone play, could cost him his job. Collins was inflexible and obsessively guarded the restaurant's image, where luxury and exclusivity reigned. Any sign of vulnerability was seen as a threat to the reputation he had built. Even so, Ethan didn't hesitate. He didn't care about the rules at that moment. Humanity spoke louder. With determined steps, Ethan approached the boy, who was staring at the violin in his hands as if it were his last hope. Thomas looked up when he sensed the guard's presence, expecting to be told to leave before he even started. He had seen that stern look before, knew what came next: the cold order to disappear, not to spoil the perfect facade of that place. But what he found in Ethan's eyes was different. "Are you going to play?" Ethan asked, his voice deep, but with a kindness the boy did not expect. Thomas nodded without saying a word. There was something unsettling about that strong man, but with a kind gaze. It was as if, for a brief moment, he was truly seen. Ethan gave a half-smile, leaning slightly toward Thomas. The guard didn't say anything else, but his eyes spoke for him. "You have permission." And in that simple gesture, Thomas felt the weight of fear ease. Ethan returned to his post, maintaining an alert posture, but his heart was with the boy preparing to play. He knew he was defying orders, knew that if Mr. Collins appeared, there would be trouble. But he also knew there were moments when compassion should override any rule. Ethan positioned himself strategically, ready to face whatever came, while the boy brought the violin to his shoulder, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a decisive moment. Thomas stood at the entrance of the restaurant, feeling the cold of the night mixed with the nervousness running through his body. His fingers, already numb from the temperature, hesitated as he adjusted the violin on his shoulder. It was a gesture he had done countless times before, but that night it felt different. The wind whispered around him, and uncertainty made him question every move. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and drew the bow across the strings, releasing the first notes into the air. The sound that emerged was timid, almost hesitant, as if the violin too were testing the environment. Thomas kept his eyes closed, focusing only on the notes that began to take shape, gaining strength with each movement of his hands. Inside him, the fear of failure and the anxiety of being rejected began to disappear, replaced by focus on the music. And as he played, the sound slowly stopped being just his and started to belong to the space around him. The notes, once so fragile, began to spread through the street, crossing the glass doors of the restaurant. The sound echoed through the dining hall, mingling with the clinking of cutlery and the murmuring of conversations. At first, few noticed, but as the melody intensified, there was something in those notes that was impossible to ignore. Thomas felt the strings vibrating under his fingers, his connection to the violin growing stronger. Every sound seemed to carry the pain and hope he held in his heart. Inside, the first customers to notice the music looked up, curious. The sound, different from anything normally heard in that place, was captivating. The soft, almost melancholic notes began to capture the attention of those who had been immersed in trivial conversations. The atmosphere began to change. Thomas didn't know it, but his music was starting to penetrate the restaurant's walls, touching the people in ways he could never have predicted. Outside, Thomas continued playing, increasingly absorbed by the melody he was creating. He no longer felt the cold. There was only him, the violin, and the music that flowed like an extension of his soul. The notes took on a life of their own, traveling through the air with an almost magical lightness. Thomas, initially gripped by nervousness, now gave himself over completely, feeling the music as something greater than himself. Inside the restaurant, the sound of the violin began to dominate the space. The laughter faded, and the conversations gradually quieted. The customers, once indifferent to the world outside, now looked towards the entrance. Some couldn't tear their gaze away, drawn in by that unexpected melody. There was something in that music that was impossible to describe, something that touched deeply, as if every note spoke directly to the heart of those who listened. Ethan, still at his position near the door, watched everything attentively. He had given Thomas a chance, but even he hadn't expected the music to have such an immediate impact. The security guard's normally vigilant and sharp eyes were now filled with a mixture of pride and surprise. He knew that, in that moment, something special was happening. Thomas's music floated in the air, pure and delicate, charged with an emotion that was almost palpable. The notes from the old violin were soft at first but carried a depth that few had ever experienced. It was as if each chord had a story to tell, a secret to reveal. The voices inside the restaurant began to disappear. What had once been a bustling, lively atmosphere was now immersed in an almost reverent silence. The wine glasses that had clinked in careless toasts now rested on tables, forgotten. The customers, dressed in their finest attire, were captivated by something they hadn't expected to find there. Thomas's music seemed to have the power to stop time, and everyone, for a brief moment, found themselves caught in the spell of that melody from outside. A woman, seated near the window, delicately placed her fork on her plate, her eyes fixed on the glass door. She tried to locate the musician, but all she could do was feel the impact of the music, as if it were touching a part of her soul she had never known. Her husband, beside her, who had been so engaged in animated conversation moments earlier, now sat silent, his eyes also locked onto the mysterious melody. There was something about Thomas's music that transcended words, something that enveloped the space and connected everyone in the same feeling. The head waiter, who normally walked around the restaurant with confidence, ensuring that everything was perfect, now stood still. He too had been struck by the sound, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know how to act. The music from the street had dismantled all his certainties. There was beauty but also sadness, a lament that seemed to echo in the hearts of those who heard it. The dining hall, once so controlled, now belonged to the freely floating notes. The waiters, still moving between tables with refined dishes, began to slow their pace. They exchanged glances as if trying to understand what was happening. It wasn't common for something from outside to capture the attention of such a demanding audience. But that music, it was different. The sound of the violin, played by someone they couldn't even see clearly, seemed to tear through the invisible veil that separated the world of luxury from the real world, and it did so with disarming honesty. Outside, Thomas continued playing, unaware of the effect he was having. His eyes remained closed, and his hands, once trembling, now moved with the confidence of someone with a mission. He didn't know that every note he played was, at that moment, being absorbed by hearts that had never imagined opening themselves to something so simple and yet so powerful. To him it was just music, but to the listeners, it was a revelation. The music began to rise, growing more intense. Each chord gained more depth, loaded with an emotion that seemed almost impossible for someone so young. The customers, all now silent, were moved. There was something visceral in that melody, something that went beyond talent. It was the pain and beauty of life translated into sound. Thomas's violin was his voice, and that night he was finally being heard, even if he didn't realize it. Ethan, watching from afar, realized the profound impact Thomas's music was having inside the restaurant. Something magical was happening, and the security guard felt he couldn't let it go unnoticed. He knew he was breaking the rules, that the restaurant owner would never approve of what he was about to do, but in that moment, none of it mattered. The boy was playing with a sincerity and emotion that Ethan hadn't seen in a long time, and it touched him deeply. Without saying a word, Ethan discreetly entered the kitchen. The chefs and assistants were so immersed in their preparations that no one noticed when he grabbed a generous plate of food and hid it under a cloth. His heart was racing, but not out of fear of being caught. He felt that what he was doing was right. Thomas had touched more than the violin strings. He had touched something inside Ethan that made it impossible for him to ignore the boy's need. With the plate in hand, Ethan exited through the side door and approached Thomas, who continued to play, unaware of what was happening around him. The notes flowed more intensely, as if the music was being fed by the boy's own soul. Ethan knelt beside him, carefully placing the plate next to him. For a moment, he simply watched the boy, playing with a passion that was hard to put into words. It wasn't just hunger that Thomas felt, it was the desire to be seen, to be heard. When Thomas opened his eyes after finishing a sequence of notes, he noticed Ethan there, with a plate of food beside him. His eyes widened in surprise and gratitude, but he said nothing. There was no need. The simple act of Ethan being there by his side, with that silent gesture of kindness, was more than Thomas could have imagined. The boy nodded slightly and with a lighter heart returned to playing, now with even more fervor, as if every note were a form of thanks. Ethan sat beside Thomas, crossing his arms and leaning slightly forward, as if protecting the boy from the world around them. The two were together in that moment, connected by something greater than words or rules. Thomas, without stopping the music, felt a wave of warmth fill his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt visible, as if someone finally saw him beyond the tattered clothes and worn violin. The sound of the violin, which had already been touching, now seemed to take on a new dimension. The music flowed with even greater depth, filled with pure emotion. Thomas wasn't just playing for food, he was playing for something far more valuable, the feeling of being understood. Ethan's presence by his side, the plate of food, the simple fact of being recognized as someone who mattered, all of this overflowed in each note. The customers inside the restaurant remained silent, unaware of Ethan's presence beside the boy. All they saw, and felt, was the intensity of the music which seemed to communicate directly with each of them. For Thomas, that moment was more than just a performance. It was the breaking of an invisible barrier that had separated him from the world. And for the first time he didn't feel alone. The night at the restaurant continued, wrapped in the magic created by Thomas's music. The violin's soft notes floated like a breeze, capturing the hearts of everyone present. The boy played with even more passion, his fingers almost dancing over the strings, while Ethan remained by his side, silent, like an invisible guardian. But that moment of tranquility and connection would soon be interrupted by the arrival of someone whose presence had the power to cool any atmosphere. Mr. Collins, the restaurant's owner, entered with an imposing air, carrying the habitual aura of severity. His figure, dressed in a flawless suit, cut through the room like a blade. He was known for being cold and inflexible, a man who maintained the perfection of his establishment at any cost. When his eyes turned toward the door where Thomas was playing, his expression immediately transformed into a mask of disdain. Collins stopped for a second, almost incredulous at what he was seeing. The sight of a dirty boy, with torn clothes, playing an old violin at the entrance of his luxurious restaurant was enough to ignite his fury. For Collins, that place was a symbol of sophistication and exclusivity, and the presence of Thomas there, like a beggar trying to get attention with street music, was an insult. His eyes narrowed, his face hardened like stone, and he advanced with firm and threatening steps. As Collins walked across the dining hall, the customers who had been enchanted by the music moments earlier noticed his presence. The atmosphere in the restaurant quickly shifted. What had been a space filled with the serenity of the melody now began to tense with the aura of Collins. He moved like an unstoppable force, his eyes fixed on Thomas, unable to hide his contempt. To him, the boy was nothing more than a stain on the impeccable image he had worked so hard to maintain. Thomas, still immersed in his music, didn't immediately notice Colin's approach. His focus was entirely on the melody he was creating, on the emotions he was pouring into each chord. But Ethan, who was watching closely, saw the restaurant owner coming towards them, and his stomach tightened. He knew what was coming. He knew Colin's temperament all too well and feared what would happen when the man finally reached the boy. When Collins arrived at the door, Thomas's music continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The sweetness of the notes, which had once enchanted the room, now seemed to clash with the coldness of the man who was hearing them. He moved closer, his hands clenched by his sides, his face etched with barely contained anger. Each step he took was like a blow to the silence that the music had created, and the customers who had been spellbound by the melody, now watched in uncertainty at what was about to happen. For a brief moment, Collins stood still watching the boy play, but any trace of admiration that could have surfaced was quickly replaced by disdain. He didn't see Thomas's talent, nor the emotion in the music. All he saw was an interruption, an affront to the perfect image of his restaurant. Thomas's music still lingered in the air when the sound of heavy footsteps suddenly overpowered the delicate melody. Collins, with fury etched into every line of his face, marched up to the boy without any concern for gentleness. With a brusque movement, he placed a heavy hand on the violin, forcing Thomas to stop playing. The music was abruptly cut off, and the silence that followed felt even sharper. Thomas looked up in surprise, his eyes meeting Collins's hard stare, and the tenderness that the music had brought vanished in an instant. "What do you think you're doing here?" Collins growled, his voice loud enough to draw everyone's attention in the restaurant. His tone was harsh, filled with disdain, as though the boy's mere presence was a personal affront. The customers who just moments ago had been immersed in the music, now turned to watch the scene. The contrast between Thomas's gentleness and Collins's brutality was shocking. "This restaurant is not a place for beggars." Thomas, stunned, took a step back, clutching the violin tightly to his chest. Collins's words hit him like a blow, more painful than any physical attack could have been. He could feel the eyes on him now, no longer admiring but judgmental, as if the magic he had created had been shattered by a cruel reality. His breath caught in his throat, and he felt the shame rise inside him, flushing his face red. "Sir, he was just," Ethan began, his voice calm but firm. He took a step toward Collins, trying to intervene before the situation escalated completely. "Did you know that the owner's temperament was unpredictable, but you couldn't remain silent in the face of such injustice?" The boy was playing. "He's not bothering anyone. I don't care." Collins interrupted Ethan, turning to face him with the same fury. His eyes sparked with frustration. "Did you let him play here? What kind of image do you think this gives to my customers? This is a respectable restaurant, not a corner for beggars to put on a show." The word beggar echoed in the air like a final blow. Thomas lowered his head, feeling each word as an additional weight on his shoulders. He was not just a boy trying to survive, not at that moment. Under Collins' gaze, he was an intrusion, a mistake that needed correction. The customers watched in silence, some clearly uncomfortable, but none dared to intervene. The air in the restaurant, once light and filled with admiration, was now heavy and tense. "He just wanted some food," Ethan insisted, his tone a little firmer but containing his frustration. "He played with his heart. Everyone here saw that." But Collins wasn't willing to listen. His vision was clouded by anger and the need to maintain his unshaken idea of perfection. "Food." He laughed, a sound without joy, only full of sarcasm. "If I let every hungry beggar play here in exchange for food, what do you think this place would become?" Thomas felt his chest tighten. Tears threatened to fall, but he held them back, trying to stay strong in the face of all the humiliation. He couldn't lift his eyes to face the people now looking down on him, as if he were just another inconvenience in their luxurious evening. The boy, who minutes ago had felt seen for the first time, was now cowering, hiding behind the violin as if that object could protect him from the world's cruelty. Ethan looked at Thomas, trying to give him strength, but he knew Collins would not yield. The restaurant was engulfed in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the low murmur of some customers and the owner's heavy breathing. The atmosphere had changed irrevocably. Collins' fury reached its peak when, out of patience, he pointed to the street and shouted with a voice filled with contempt, "Get out of here! And don't come back!" The sound of his voice echoed through the restaurant, and the impact was immediate. All eyes were on Thomas, who was holding the violin so tightly his fingers turned white. With every word Collins uttered, the boy's heart broke a little more. The air, once vibrant with music, now seemed cold and hostile. Thomas could barely process the humiliation. Tears threatened to fall, but he tried with all his might to hold them back. He didn't want to cry there in front of everyone. He didn't want to give Collins the power to see him break. But the knot in his throat tightened and the shame crushed him. He felt small, invisible again, as if everything he had achieved with his music had been cruelly taken away in a matter of minutes. "Come on, just leave," Collins shouted again, his eyes hardened with no sign of compassion. To him, Thomas was nothing more than a stain on his perfect evening, an obstacle that needed removal to restore order. The coldness with which the owner treated the boy shocked even the customers, many of whom were still entranced by the music that, minutes ago, seemed to have touched something deep within them. Now, that moment of beauty had been brutally destroyed. With no choice, Thomas stepped back, the violin still pressed firmly to his chest as if it was all he had left. His eyes, once filled with hope, were now clouded by pain and shame. He turned slowly, his head bowed, trying to hide his tear-streaked face. Each step toward the door felt heavy, as if the weight of the world was on his frail shoulders. Ethan watched everything powerless. He wanted to do something, wanted to fight for Thomas, but he knew challenging Collins again would only worsen the situation. His jaw was tense, and his clenched fists at his sides revealed his frustration. He had seen the boy's soul through his music, had felt the purity and truth Thomas put into every note. And now, seeing him being thrown out as if he were worthless, that devastated him. "Wait, you don't need to," Ethan tried one last time, his voice low, almost a whisper. But Collins silenced him with a fierce look, making it clear there was no room for further discussion. Ethan bit his lip, unable to continue. Collins' power and coldness were like a wall, and Ethan knew he couldn't break through it at that moment. Thomas, with a broken heart, finally crossed the restaurant's door, his steps quick, almost running as the cold night wrapped around him again. Tears now flowed freely down his face and he no longer tried to hide them. He clutched the violin to his chest as if it were the only anchor keeping him upright. The street was empty, but inside him the echo of Collins' cruel words resonated, filling every part of him with deep pain. Inside, the restaurant was left in a tense silence. The charm of the music had disappeared, replaced by Collins' coldness. Many of the customers looked at their plates, unable to process what had just happened. Some seemed ashamed, others merely uncomfortable. But no one dared raise their voice. The atmosphere, once so lively and luxurious, now felt heavy, as if something valuable had been lost in that expulsion. Ethan, still standing by the door, felt consumed by frustration. He knew he shouldn't have let it happen, but the power Collins held over the restaurant was absolute. With a heavy heart, he took one last look at the door through which Thomas had left before slowly returning to his post. The next day dawned cold, with a light mist covering the city streets. At Collins' restaurant, the atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive. The staff moved automatically, and there was something unspoken in the air, a silent discomfort. The scene from the previous night still lingered over the place like a shadow. Many remembered the devastated look on Thomas's face as he was thrown out, and although no one spoke aloud, the image of the boy with his violin was hard to forget. Ethan, especially, was restless, his face closed, carrying the weight of not having been able to do more. Around noon, when the restaurant was beginning to fill up for lunch, something unusual happened. A tall, elegant man entered the place, wearing a dark overcoat and a felt hat. His steps were slow and sure, and his presence caught everyone's attention as soon as he crossed the door. The maître, who recognized him immediately, rushed to greet him with a nervous smile. This was not just any customer, it was Victor Moretti, an internationally renowned conductor whose performances had moved audiences around the world. Collins, who was at the back of the hall chatting with some regular customers, also noticed the maestro's entrance and quickly hurried over to greet him personally. He knew someone like Moretti would bring prestige to his restaurant. He adjusted his tie with a quick touch and put on a cordial smile as he approached the maestro. "Mr. Moretti, what an honor to have you here," Collins said, with his usual formality and forced charm. Moretti, however, didn't seem interested in pleasantries. His scrutinizing gaze swept across the hall with a calmness that contrasted with the tension in the air. He requested a table near the windows, where he could observe the movement outside. Collins, with his fake smile, made sure to personally accompany the maestro to the table, suggesting the best dishes on the menu, but Moretti seemed distant, as if his mind was occupied with another matter. After sitting down, the maestro remained silent for a while, watching the movement of the streets beyond the windows. When he finally spoke, his deep voice cut through the air directly. "I heard something curious about your restaurant last night. A boy from the street playing violin here." Collins froze for a moment. He hadn't expected the incident from the night before to reach the ears of someone like Victor Moretti. He tried to control the situation, forcing a smile as he replied, "Ah yes, a small inconvenience. A boy trying to take advantage of our clientele. I took care of it, of course." Moretti raised an eyebrow, clearly not satisfied with the answer. His dark eyes fixed on Collins as if they could see beyond the empty words. "Take advantage?" the maestro repeated slowly, as if savoring the word carefully. "I heard a different version. I heard this boy is an exceptional violinist. So exceptional that it made me come here to confirm something." Collins' usual coldness began to wane under the weight of Moretti's intense gaze. He tried to maintain control, but there was something about the maestro's presence that made him uncomfortable. "A street violinist?" Collins laughed, trying to downplay the situation. "Just another boy, nothing more." But Moretti didn't seem willing to be convinced. He leaned forward a little, his eyes still fixed on Collins. "That, just another boy, if I'm not mistaken, is Thomas Lancaster, isn't he?" Upon hearing the name, the restaurant, which had been immersed in murmurs, fell silent. The restaurant plunged into a cold silence when the name Thomas Lancaster was spoken by Moretti. Collins blinked a few times as if trying to grasp what he had just heard, but the impact of the maestro's words was already spreading throughout the room. The staff stopped moving, the customers exchanged glances, and the air, which had been heavy with discomfort, now seemed electrified with a restless curiosity. What no one expected was that the street boy, humiliated and thrown out the night before, had such a significant past. Victor Moretti leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms calmly, but his gaze never left Collins. "Thomas Lancaster," he repeated with emphasis. "The boy who enchanted social media a few years ago before disappearing completely. A prodigy whose talent was compared to the great names in classical music. The boy who, due to unfortunate circumstances, fell into poverty, but whose gift remained intact. The one you apparently, publicly humiliated here last night." Collins' face, once haughty, now began to pale. He tried to maintain composure, but the revelation hit him like a direct blow. The name Thomas was starting to make sense. He vaguely remembered stories about a young violinist who had gained notoriety on social media for his incredible skill but had mysteriously disappeared after a family tragedy. And now, this same boy was on the streets, playing to survive, and Collins had treated him as a nobody. I didn't know." Collins' voice finally came out, hesitant as he looked around, trying to avoid the judging eyes surrounding him. "No one told me who he was. He seemed just like another street boy." Moretti sighed, shaking his head slowly. "And if he wasn't Thomas, if he were just a common boy? Would that justify the way he was treated?" The maestro's words cut deep, and Collins recoiled, unable to provide an immediate answer. Shame began to settle in, not just for Collins, but also for the others who had passively watched Thomas's humiliation the night before. Everyone knew the boy had been treated coldly, but now that indifference seemed even crueler in the face of the truth. Ethan, who had heard everything from his position in the back, felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Thomas's true story was being revealed, but sadness knowing that it wouldn't erase what the boy had been through. He remembered Thomas's tears, the way he had clutched the violin to his chest, trying to protect himself from a cruelty he didn't deserve. Now, with Moretti exposing the reality, all Ethan felt was the desire that, somehow, Thomas could be healed from the damage Collins had caused him. The customers, in absolute silence, absorbed every word. For them, it was almost surreal that the boy who had played with such passion the night before was, in fact, a prodigy once acclaimed for his musical genius. Some shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable with the fact that they had watched everything without intervening, while others felt a strange sense of guilt. "He doesn't deserve to be on the streets," Moretti continued with a softer tone, yet laden with emotion. "And yet, fate brought him here, in front of people who should have seen his value but instead treated him as a nuisance." His eyes met Collins's again, and the weight of those words seemed to crush the restaurant owner. Collins ran a hand over his forehead as if trying to wipe away the weight of guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. There was no excuse that could justify what he had done. The silence that followed was dense, full of unspoken meanings. Collins looked at the floor, unable to find words that could remedy the situation. Collins felt the overwhelming weight of shame. The revelation that the boy he had humiliated was a prodigy, someone who had once been praised for his innate talent, left him disoriented. His hands trembled slightly as he thought about how he could repair the damage he had caused. The maestro Moretti remained seated, with a silent expression of disappointment, watching Collins wrestle with his conscience. It was clear the restaurant owner didn't know how to handle the situation. He looked around, searching for something, anything he could say to undo the harm. Collins began, his voice lower than usual. He approached Moretti, even more hesitant, trying to find the words. If the boy has this talent, I can help him. I can offer lessons with the best musicians in the city, put his name back in the spotlight. He could play regularly in my restaurant, attracting the attention of important clients. There was desperation in his tone, as if he were trying to buy everyone's forgiveness, especially his own. The maestro observed him without changing his expression. Collins was used to fixing things with money, with opportunities, and he seemed to believe that would be enough for Thomas as well. Lessons, performances. Collins continued, his voice a little firmer, as if convinced this was an irresistible offer. You will have everything he needs. I guarantee it. He looked around, seeking approval from Moretti, the clients, from anyone who could relieve him of the guilt suffocating him. For a moment, the restaurant remained silent, the clients still shocked by the unfolding revelation. Some gazes were fixed on Collins, trying to understand whether this sudden attempt at redemption was genuine or merely a way to save his own image. Others looked at Moretti, waiting for his reaction, eager to see how the story would unfold. Ethan, standing at the back, listened attentively but was skeptical of the owner's words. He knew Collins knew his coldness, and the sudden change sounded more like desperation than genuine remorse. The idea of having him play here. Collins went on, now trying to make his offer more appealing. It would bring great visibility to the restaurant. He would have a guaranteed spot, the right audience, and I would do whatever it takes to make sure Thomas Lancaster's name returns to the prominence he deserves. There was an attempt to sound magnanimous, but everyone in the restaurant could feel that Collins was more interested in restoring his own reputation. Moretti remained silent, studying the restaurant owner. It was clear that Collins was desperately trying to find a solution that would not only redeem his error but also recover his establishment's image. However, something essential was missing from his offer: genuineness. The intention to help Thomas seemed more a consequence of his need to remedy his own situation than a real desire to do good. Collins began to feel anxious with the silence dominating the room. He looked at Moretti, then at the clients, trying to decipher their expressions. He was used to controlling the space around him, but here, in this moment, he seemed to have no power left. His words, which before had been used to manipulate and charm, now sounded empty, and he knew it. But what else could he do? I deeply regret what happened yesterday, Collins said, now in a softer tone, as if trying to approach a sincerity he rarely showed. If I had known who he was, I would never have acted that way. I want to fix this. I will give the boy the opportunity he deserves. The clients remained silent, exchanging discreet looks. Many knew that Collins was trying to save himself, but there was a silent hope that, perhaps, behind that facade of remorse, he really wanted to change. Thomas entered the restaurant with slow, steady steps, holding the violin in his hands as he had always done. The news about the incident had spread quickly, and despite still being shaken by the humiliation of the previous night, he knew he couldn't simply run away from the situation. The restaurant was full, all eyes fixed on him. Maestro Moretti sat, watching attentively. Collins, anxious, took a step forward, with a nervous smile on his lips, hoping his offer would be received as a gesture of redemption. With surprising calmness for someone so young, Thomas stopped in the middle of the hall. His eyes were deep, filled with pain but also something more, a maturity beyond his years. He looked at Collins, who observed him with a mixture of guilt and expectation. The restaurant owner still believed he could fix everything with a generous offer, with opportunities and promises of success. But Thomas, at that moment, knew the issue went far beyond success or opportunities. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Collins," Thomas began, his voice clear but charged with controlled emotion. The silence in the restaurant was absolute, and every word he spoke seemed to resonate in the space. "I appreciate that you want to help me now. But," he paused, taking a deep breath as if needing a moment to organize his thoughts, "what happened here cannot be erased with promises of lessons or chances to play in your restaurant." Collins, confused, tried to remain calm. He hadn't expected a refusal. "I understand, Thomas," he said quickly, trying to correct himself. "But you need to know that I am willing to do anything to make amends. I am truly sorry for what happened." Thomas kept his gaze steady on the man in front of him. "I know you are, but what hurt the most wasn't the lack of recognition for my talent, it was the way I was treated." His voice didn't waver, but the depth of his words made the atmosphere even more tense. "You didn't see me as a person, only as a problem to be solved, an obstacle in your way. I can't accept help from someone who only sees me as a means to restore their reputation. The silence became even denser. Thomas, who had once hidden in the shadows, now spoke with a firmness that impressed everyone. He raised the violin, looking at it as if seeking strength in the memories the instrument carried. What brought me here, what gave me strength to carry on, wasn't your offer. It was the kindness of someone who saw me as a human being. Thomas turned toward Ethan, who was standing near the door, watching everything with eyes filled with restrained emotion. It was Ethan, Thomas continued, a slight smile on his lips. He gave me food when no one else cared. He saw me not for what I could do but for who I was. He made me believe that there's still kindness in the world, that there are still people who see beyond appearances. Ethan, visibly moved, lowered his head for a moment, as if needing to process what he had just heard. Collins, who had remained motionless until then, felt the sting of Thomas's words. Each one was a reminder that his attempt at redemption wasn't rooted in true empathy, but in selfish desperation. He opened his mouth to try again, but something in Thomas's gaze made him stop. He knew it was too late to fix things with words. Thomas, for his part, continued, now with a lighter tone. I know I'm just a boy, but what I've learned from music is that it comes from the heart. And everything I do must come from a genuine place. That's why I can't accept your offer, Mr. Collins. I thank you, but the path I will follow won't be defined by an attempt to remedy a mistake. It will be guided by those who truly believe in me. Thomas's words echoed through the restaurant like a lesson everyone there learned in a painful way. The boy, who had been humiliated and disrespected, was now showing a maturity that many adults there had yet to reach. He had chosen dignity. He had decided to follow his own path without allowing himself to be corrupted by the temptation of easy but empty offers. Ethan, still speechless, simply looked at Thomas with silent admiration. At that moment, he knew the boy was destined for something far greater than anyone there could offer. Days later, Thomas walked through the city streets with a new feeling in his chest. He still carried his violin, but now, instead of uncertainty, there was hope. Maestro Moretti had promised to give him something much bigger, something he hardly dared to dream of. The opportunity to play with a great orchestra. It was the chance many musicians spent years fighting for, and for Thomas, it was proof that even in the hardest situations, music and kindness had the power to change lives. Moretti introduced him to the orchestra's musicians with an almost reverent respect. They welcomed him with curiosity, some already recognizing his name, others eager to hear the sound that had impressed a world-renowned conductor. When Thomas took his violin and began to play with the orchestra, something magical happened. The notes that had once been filled with pain and loneliness now merged with the orchestra's grand melodies, creating a harmony that filled the hall with a palpable energy. Each chord seemed to tell his journey from street boy to revealed prodigy. As Thomas shone under the concert hall lights, Collins' restaurant, once a symbol of sophistication and luxury, began facing a new reality. The story of Thomas and his humiliation had spread through the city, and the place, once sought after, was now avoided by many. There was an irreversible stain on the reputation Collins had so carefully guarded, and despite his efforts to clean up his image, the public didn't forget the cruelty he had shown on that fateful night. The restaurant, which had once prided itself on being untouchable, now struggled to maintain its relevance. As Collins' restaurant declined, Ethan thrived. His courage and compassion that night did not go unnoticed, and he was promoted to head of security, a position that gave him more authority but also more responsibility. Even with his new role, Ethan remained true to who he always was, a man with an open heart who not only maintained order but also helped those in need. For him, the promotion was not just recognition of his work but confirmation that his kindness made a difference. The days that followed were like a transformation for Thomas. He didn't just win the applause of audiences but something much more valuable. He regained the dignity that had been stripped from him by life's adversities. Music, which had always been his only companion, was now his passport to a bright future. Every note he played echoed like a celebration of his resilience, a testament that even in the shadows, talent and kindness would always find a way to shine. The relationship between Thomas and Moretti also deepened. The maestro didn't just see a young prodigy, he saw a soul marked by struggles and losses, but who had never given up on dreaming. Moretti took Thomas under his wing, teaching him not only about music but about life and the opportunities that awaited him. For Thomas, Moretti was more than a mentor. He was a figure offering him the chance to reconnect with the world in a way he had thought was no longer possible. Meanwhile, Collins, despite trying to erase the mistake of the past, found himself increasingly isolated. The restaurant, once a jewel of the city, was now remembered more for the scandal than for the quality of its dishes. He tried to reinvent his business, but the absence of soul in the place was felt by everyone. The lesson he should have learned was clear. It wasn't just about luxury and prestige, but about how we treat others, especially the most vulnerable. Thomas, in his performances with the orchestra, carried with him every experience, every struggle, every tear. The concert hall, filled with people, applauded him standing. His eyes shone with a mix of gratitude and triumph as he bowed before the crowd. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but now he was no longer alone. Music would guide him as it always had, but now there were also people by his side who believed in him. At the end of each concert, Thomas remembered Ethan. It wasn't the applause of the crowd that motivated him, but the act of kindness from the security guard on that cold night. It was that simple gesture of genuine compassion that lit the flame of hope in Thomas's heart. He knew that without Ethan he might never have found the strength to keep going. And that, more than any offer or contract, was what kept him moving forward, with the violin in his hands and music in his heart. If you enjoyed Thomas's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and wish to support our channel to continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next exciting chronicle.